Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. First, apologies for, I think this was meant to be 2 or 3 weeks ago, the seminar, and then I developed laryngitis and I lost my voice, and of all the itises you can possibly develop for tajweed, it was a complete non-starter. So apologies for those of you who'd registered for the course and the very last minute rescheduling. So welcome back, and apologies also for this delay. We're about 25 minutes in already. Abu Kawthar has kindly given a bit of an introduction already to tajweed. I mean, we can start straight with the notes. The notes basically go into an introduction on tajweed, and the notes that were circulated are basically the text for this course. And I was just saying to those who are present and for those who are online, for your benefit as well, have the notes to hand, because we'll be going through these notes as we're going through the day, inshallah. Like I said, we started a little bit late. We'll try and finish on time, if not a little bit early, inshallah. I've been asked by the organizers to, if you've got questions, then to try and leave them towards the end of the sessions, and I'll get prompts to ask me to stop talking and take questions towards the end of each session. But if anybody wants any clarifications at any point throughout, then just stick your hand up and the mics are with you. As I've also said to those who are here on site, I'll be asking you to read from the notes as we go along, and as you go through a few parts of the notes, I'll stop and then I'll clarify or expand on whatever is in the notes. Abu Kawthar mentioned that the purpose of this course is to give you the foundations of tajweed. Tajweed, I mean, as a science, there's a lot of depth. Any science within the Islamic disciplines, as you know, has a lot of depth. I think all of you are studying here at Al-Salam at various levels, right? Kind of foundation or intermediate or possibly advanced as well. And then tajweed, you can study at any of those levels and beyond. The aim of this is to give you the basics of tajweed. And tajweed, in that sense, is a beautiful discipline, and that is very self-contained. You can go away after this day, inshallah, with having covered all the basic rules of tajweed. After, of course, it's practice. And part of this course, or part of this seminar, the seminar is the introduction to tajweed from a theory point of view. The actual practice or the applied recitation, I'll continue with you, inshallah, online over this term and the following term and the term thereafter. So this is the introductory aspect of it. For some of you, I think it may be recitation of the revision of these rules. Some of you may have studied them some time ago, and it's basically revising those. But as I said, there's a lot of depth. I won't get much into the depth or the kind of various differences of opinion or readings, a lot of which is very interesting, and a lot of which is related to the historical development of tajweed and the compilation of the Quran and the qira'at, the various readings or the variant readings of the Quran. But I mean, if anybody has questions on those, I'm happy to take those and address them perhaps in the breaks or at the end of the sessions. Abu Kawthar, again, in the introduction, he may have mentioned a few terms which may or may not be familiar to you. So terms like ijazat, the jazariya, names like Sheikh Bakri Tarabishi, so people who are very well regarded, rahimahullah, who are very well regarded in the science of tajweed. If those names mean nothing to you at the moment, not to worry, but if you'd like to know more about them, we can talk about them across today, inshallah. So, in terms of the format, you've got the structure for today, and we'll try and keep roughly to that structure, inshallah. We'll start from the notes. On the very first page, where the notes actually start, you've got an introduction and foundations to tajweed. I'll start on the right. If anybody's not comfortable reading, that's fine. But if you're happy to read, then please do. And so start off, if you can, on the right with the introduction. Just telling us about what tajweed is. Just remember to unmute the mic. It's there's a button towards the head. So you'll all hopefully become familiar with the mic across today, because
Sorry, I'm going to have to take a bit small brief on this. So the microphones, you're going to have to hold them like this, as close to your mouth, because when you're seeing the speakers and you point outwards, you make some weird noise. Every time you want to ask a question, you need to unmute the mic. When the light's on, it's mute. And make sure you put it back on mute again, otherwise all your chit-chats will get picked up by the online students. Is that okay? Yeah.
Not that there'll be any chit-chat, of course.
No, they're not that
Okay, do I start from which page?
So on the first page, there's the 3 lines of poetry. Don't worry about the poetry, but that poetry basically is 3 lines talking about the... So the reference that I mentioned on the top page, Introduction and Foundations to Tajweed, I think it's titled. There are 3 lines of poetry which I've taken from the author who I've referenced there, who, in introducing Tajweed, he basically says there are a number of things that people can consider when they're talking about any discipline, any science. So you can talk about the name of the science, what it's called, where it's derived from, who the founders were. And we're going to talk about some of those things just to get a feel for what Tajweed is before we dive into the rules of Tajweed, as it were.
So from the definition?
From the definition, absolutely.
Okay, linguistically, beautification. Technically, given each letter its beautiful right as regard its point of articulation and its qualities and reciting the Quran in accordance with the way in which the Muslim have received it from the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
So, have you guys come across this differentiation between a linguistic definition and a technical definition? Is that so? In Arabic, they call it lughawi or lughatan and istilahan. So, for anybody who's not come across it, everybody's nodding their heads, which is a good thing. For each of you, whatever your area of expertise, whatever your discipline is, you'll use certain words that are used in the English language to have a very specific meaning or a very particular meaning within your line of work, whatever it might be. So for me as a medic, for example, the word shock means something very different to what shock would mean in English language or from a dictionary definition point of view. And each of you in your disciplines, you'll have something similar. So tajweed, similarly, I mean, in the language, in Arabic language, what does it mean? It's not used very commonly, but it means to improve something, to beautify something. So tahseen would be a synonym for it in Arabic. So improvement or beautification. And of course, from a technical point of view, as regards the science that we're studying, it means much more. And that's what you've just read there. So it's regarding, makharij, where letters are articulated from. That's kind of the theory side of things, the qualities of letters, stopping and starting, how to stop when reciting the Quran, how to start again when reciting the Quran, how tajweed was transmitted, or the way of recitation was transmitted to us from the Prophet ﷺ through the Sahaba, etc. That science is the science of tajweed, and that's what we're going to be reading a little bit more about now, inshallah. If you could read on, please. So,
Area of application, the words of the Quran.
So that's immediately obvious, I hope. So tajweed, people generally, Arabs today and probably Arabs in the past as well, didn't speak with mud. They didn't go around saying malaika. They would say malaika. So tajweed, as we teach it and as we recite Quran, is applied specifically to the words of the Quran. It's very closely associated with the Arabic language, as we'll see a little bit later. But tajweed is a science. Its application, where is it applied? It's applied within the words of the Quran, within the recitation of the Quran. Thank you. And next. Okay, if you, let's just carry on this way. So it's the guys. Do you have the mic? There should be a mic on that side as well somewhere.
Benefits, protecting the tongue from erring in recitation of the Book of Allah, seeking Allah's pleasure in doing so.
So the reason we do anything in life and Islamically more generally is seeking Allah's pleasure. And the purpose for why you may all have various reasons for why you're here and why you're studying tajweed, but ultimately the reason why we're learning tajweed or studying tajweed is to protect, as you said, protect our tongue from erring in the recitation of Allah's book and in seeking Allah's pleasure in doing so. Anytime we do something, we try and do it in the correct way and with the correct intention. And those two things are key here as well, of course, with tajweed. The next bit.
Virtue. One of the noblest and most virtuous of sciences for its association with the sole application in the noblest and most virtuous of books. But note that it is not, of course, an end in itself, but a means through which to eventually, inshallah, better access, understand, contemplate, and act upon Allah's guidance.
So like I said, I drew a lot of this introduction from Dr. Yahya Abdul-Razak al-Ghawthani, the author I referenced at the beginning of this page. And he describes it as of the noblest and most virtuous of sciences. And I slightly disagree in that I think if you're a scholar of tajweed or a scholar of the Quran, you will slightly blow your own trumpet. So the sciences that you teach or the sciences that you study, you will see them as the most noblest and most virtuous of sciences, etc. I think there are other sciences, like the science of hadith, for example, which are probably more virtuous, more noble, and they are also associated with the Quran because you don't understand the Quran without the hadith, of course. Likewise, tafsir, likewise Arabic language, for example. And tajweed is a small part of Arabic. I'm slightly dissing tajweed here, and you're here for a whole day of tajweed, but it's important, it's key, it's a core part of learning how to recite and learning the Arabic language. But it's an introductory science. It should very much be recognized as such. There are people like Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, and others who have cautioned against focusing too much on tajweed because when you study tajweed to a higher level, you start focusing on things like ghunna, like qalqala, these various rules that we'll study today. How long was that mud? Did the reciter apply that particular quality there? And you're completely losing the point of the recitation of the Quran. The Quran is a book of guidance. It's not a book of linguistics or a book of phonetics. Of course, it should sound right. Just like when we speak English, we speak English properly, or whatever language that we speak it properly for the purpose of communication. But ultimately, it's the content of that communication that's important, not exactly how you're saying things. That how you're saying things or how you're reciting things is a core key part of how it's done, but then there's much more beyond that. And that kind of brings me to a slight rant, which has been becoming rantier and rantier over the years, I think. But we've had for generations, I think, again, depending on what communities you come from, for generations we've taught, so certainly like in the Indo-Pak community, where I've largely grown up, we've taught children how to recite Quran or read Quran. And what that means is basically pattern recognition. They learn how to read Arabic. Now, if you say you know how to read English, that means you understand English and you can read the English language. You have an understanding of the English language. When we learn how to read Arabic, we're learning to pattern recognize, and we don't go beyond that. We see that as sufficient. Now, I'm not saying at all that there's no reward in learning how to read the Quran in that pattern recognition kind of way, because there is reward in that, and that there are hadith that support that as well. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ saying, for example, about the words or the letters alif lam mim, saying that there's a reward in reciting those, and he says, وَلَا أَقُولَ أَنَّ أَلِفْ لَام مِيمٌ حَرْفٌ وَلَكِنْ أَلِفٌ حَرْفٌ وَلَامٌ حَرْفٌ وَمِيمٌ حَرْفٌ. I don't say that alif lam mim is a letter, but rather alif is a letter, lam is a letter, mim is a letter, and for each of these are 10 rewards or more. The point of that, of course, is that alif lam mim, nobody knows what these letters mean. Nobody knows what these words, these huruf muqatta'a, these interrupted letters that come at the beginning of certain surahs, nobody but Allah knows what they actually mean. So there is reward, the Prophet ﷺ says, in reciting even those letters. So I don't deny that there is reward, and great reward in reciting that, but why we stop at that, I don't know, slightly boggles my mind. But I hope, inshallah, for the generations to come, from the point of view of Islamic literacy, we as a generation and beyond, inshallah, we should raise that level of literacy such that we're not just learning to pattern recognize, we're actually learning to read, right, to understand the language. And tajweed is a small part of reading even. It's not even the complete aspect of reading. It's a part of reading. And beyond reading, of course, there's understanding. Beyond understanding, there's contemplating. Beyond contemplating, there's acting upon Allah's word. And that's how it becomes a form of guidance, not just through reading. I keep dissing tajweed. It's important. I promise you it is important. But we'll develop that across today, inshallah. The next part, please. Is it? If it's unmuted, then the light should be off.
Relationship to other sciences. It is different in the sense that it is not possible for one to excel in this field without a skilled teacher to teach and a correct pronunciation and recitation.
I should probably get rid of skill. This is slightly blowing my own trumpet. So I mean, I hope inshallah I can teach you something. But it is, and I do agree with this in that other sciences you can start developing through reading. No science you can develop to its fullest extent without a teacher, of course. But with tajweed in particular, I think to start with a teacher from the outset, just like when you're learning a language, to start with somebody who can teach you the language well. And tajweed is mostly about articulation and pronunciation. Are you guys aware what the differences between articulation and pronunciation? The words are sometimes used interchangeably. Does anybody have a background in linguistics by any chance? They can contribute quite a lot to this class, if so. If not, not to worry. So articulation, if I use words which are, the meaning of which is unclear, please let me know. So articulation is how a particular letter is articulated. Pronunciation is how letters come together into words and then how they're pronounced thereafter. Does that make sense? So articulation, letters, pronunciation, words. That was a tangent. We were talking about teachers. So having a teacher, so if you're starting to learn to recite the Quran, starting from the very beginning, either the alphabet and the makharij, we'll talk about what makharij are shortly, how letters are articulated, having a teacher who can teach you that from the outset and then how they're put together, i.e. pronunciation, into tajweed, it's helpful to have that from the very beginning and then onwards to be supervised in your reading so that you can continue to improve. So yeah, absolutely. So having a teacher is imperative. Like with any other discipline, but in tajweed particularly so, right from the outset. If we come back to the second row for the sisters. Again, if you're comfortable reading, please do it. Particularly later on when we're going to be doing the makharij and practicing letters, if you can recite or even just practice the makharij, it'll be really helpful so I can feedback to you on your recitation, on your articulation. So second row of the sisters.
Founder. Theory. Initially, the Imams of recitation of the Arabic language, Khalil and his student Sibawayh, died 180 after Hijri and 797 after AD, an independent science towards the end of the 3rd century. Musa al-Khaqani, 248 to 325, poet and reciter of Baghdad.
I'll just expand on that briefly. So Musa al-Khaqani, I won't say much about him, but he's in the 3rd century Hijri. He's a person who's often attributed to have been the first person to compose an independent work on tajweed. But prior to that, tajweed, as you can imagine, when we're talking about phonetics and articulation of letters, it's actually a very integral aspect of language, as we've said. So the people who first start writing or talking about tajweed are the people of language, the people of Nahu. Have you all heard of Sibawayh? Anybody not heard of Sibawayh? So Sibawayh, again, you can Google him, but he's he's considered probably, I mean, he wasn't Arab himself, but he's considered amongst the greatest of Arab grammarians. And his book, I'm still looking for the title of this book. I've not yet found it, but the book is so well known in Nahw, in grammar, in Arabic language. It's known just as Al-Kitab, the book. And I've not yet found the actual formal title of the book, despite having looked for it. So if anybody finds it, please do let me know. But so he's the author of the book in Arabic language. And actually, in the appendix of this book, this is a 2nd century after Hijri book. In the appendix of this book, he starts commenting on things like makharij, so the articulation points of letters, etc. So this starts happening very, very early in Islam. And these are the founders that you said were of the theoretical aspect of tajweed. So it'll be helpful here just to say what we mean by theory and applied. So when we're talking about things like, where does this letter originate from, this nasal sound, this ghunna thing, this qalqala, this bouncing sound, this mud, how long is this mud, all of these theoretical details, these rules, or ahkam al-tajweed, these are later developments. Just like, for example, the science of hadith, usul hadith. I mean, the hadith, of course, are what the Prophet ﷺ did, said, what he approved of. So those things, of course, were happening at the time of the Prophet ﷺ by definition. But the science of hadith, how these hadith were transmitted, developed later. Similarly, tajweed, the Prophet ﷺ recited the Quran in a particular way. So the applied aspect of tajweed, how the Prophet ﷺ recited, that was transmitted to us in an applied way. He taught the Sahaba, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, and they taught the Tabi'een, etc., etc. But the theory, as we've just read here, developed later. And the theory developed really in response to what was happening at the time. So the Muslims had expanded beyond the Hijaz, beyond the Arab-speaking part of the world, if you like. And there were people, as there are today, for whom Arabic was not their first language. And they needed additional help to help fine-tune or improve their reading, speaking, recitation in particular of the Quran. And so this theory developed, the theory of tajweed developed to help aid that. And if you move on to the founders of the applied aspect of tajweed.
Applied. From the revelation to the Prophet ﷺ and the teaching of Jibreel alayhi thereafter the Prophet ﷺ's teaching to his companions and they to their students and so on.
So this is the root of transmission, or the riwayah. And really, so we mentioned the term ijazah. Has anybody not heard the term ijazah? I keep asking, getting no response. Please just stick your hand up if you haven't heard the term ijazah. I'll explain it briefly anyway. So an ijazah basically is an authority to transmit, and it's a kind of a degree, if you like, or I mean, shahada is probably the more appropriate term for that. But it's an authority to transmit a particular branch of knowledge or aspect of knowledge from one's teacher. So Abu Qathar mentioned earlier that, for example, my ijazah in the riwayah, the narration of Hafs from Asim. And again, we'll mention these people. We'll talk about these terms shortly. So the way I've learned to read the Quran, I've been given ijazah, I've been given the authority to transmit that from my teacher. So these ijazat, they have chains of transmission. And this science of the chains of transmission, or asanid, is drawn from the science of hadith. And it was imperative in that setting because very early on people had started fabricating hadith and saying from the Prophet ﷺ what was not from him to further whatever political aims or whatever aims they might have had. So it's very important very early on to establish a means through which people could authentically establish what was from the Prophet ﷺ and what was not. And that science, a lot of other people drew from it. I mean, the Sufis drew from it, the Nahwis, the grammarians drew from it. So they would say that this particular grammatical rule, I have it on the authority of such and such a person, from such and such a person, etc. So that became commonplace, and also became commonplace in Quran. And in a way, I mean, in Quran was so widespread that nobody was ever going to say that this isn't Quran. And from the very first, that challenge was in the Quran itself. The Quran was established, and Allah had promised to preserve it, and it was preserved through miraculous means, but also through means of people who were working to preserve it. And that you can read in terms of compilation of the Quran, etc. There are various works on that in terms of how that preservation actually happened. But that route of transmission, it exists for the way we recite the Quran, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the amazing thing about it is the sanad, this chain of transmission with the hadith. It's from the student to the teacher to the etc. to the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, being a hadith, it stops with the Prophet ﷺ. The mind-blowing thing with the Quran is that it goes to the Prophet ﷺ, of course, but this is revelation, al-wahy al-munazzal, this is from Allah. So it goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and then in our asanid, in the sanad that we have for recitation, it goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and then through to Jibreel alayhi salam, and then to Allah. And that, I mean, having that in a sanad is amazing. I mean, having a sanad to the Prophet ﷺ in itself is amazing. But then in the Quran, that goes from the Prophet ﷺ to Jibreel alayhi salam to Allah, Jalla Jalaluh. So that's the applied aspect of tajweed. Next.
Name the science, knowledge of beautification in recitation, the art of measured recitation, the right of recitation.
So these are just some synonyms or terms for tajweed. Ilm al-tajweed, the science of tajweed, fann al-tartil, the art of recitation, haqq al-tilawa, the right of recitation. As we'll see later in one of the verses that I've quoted on this page, حق tilawa again is perhaps it's probably not a term which is appropriate for tajweed alone. So the right of recitation, as we've kind of touched upon earlier, is not just to recite it with tajweed. There is much more to giving recitation its full right than just reciting it with tajweed. Come back to the guys. Do you have the mic? Yeah, of course. Just use a mic.
You said there's another right, like the tajweed rules.
So the thing that we mentioned earlier.
Aren't the only right.
So the rights of recitation are tajweed, so reciting it properly. But then, as we said earlier, then understanding what's being recited, contemplating upon, so tadabbur, tafakkur, and then amal, so acting upon it. So those are the actual rights of recitation, and that, inshallah, is what leads to guidance and what makes it a book of guidance.
Derivation from commands in Quranic verses, from the action of the Prophet ﷺ and his method of teaching to the companions, thereafter through its preservation by the Qurra, such that the Quran has reached us through successive generations without there being any doubt in its narration.
So where do we get tajweed from? As you've just read, basically. It may help to expand here a little bit on the Qurra. So we've used this term Qurra, which is plural of Qari or Qari. So again, depending on what kind of ethnic background you come from, the term Qari might mean very different things to you. So traditionally people use the word Qari, traditionally of course, depending on what tradition you come from, but people generally associate the word Qari with people like Qari Abdul Basit, for example. So people who are well known for their melodious recitation, and technically from a tajweed point of view, very correct recitation as well, but for their melodious recitation. And I don't want this to sound derogatory, because it's not meant to be, but as a kind of a performance thing. So they would recite in a melodious way where people would gather and listen for enjoyment and for pleasure. And there's no harm, of course, in that, but again, it's one small aspect of the Quran. There are much more important aspects of the Quran, as I keep saying. So Qari in the science of tajweed refers to people who are experts in recitation, and that's basically what Qari means. So the word Quran, of course, means the reading or the recitation, and a Qari is one who has mastered the recitation of the Quran. Other terms which are similar are Muqri', so al-Muqri', which for those of you who are studying Arabic as a language is the fourth form of the verb, so Aqra' yuqri'u. Muqri' is one who makes others recite the Quran, but it's used technically to mean somebody who's an expert in the various different readings of the Quran. And again, it may help just to touch upon this a little bit. I said I wouldn't go into it in too much depth, but most of you will be familiar with the fact that the Quran can be read and is read in different ways. And these are transmissions from the Prophet ﷺ onwards. And the one that probably most of you will be familiar with, unless there are any people from Libya or North Africa, kind of Morocco, Algeria, is the riwayah, the narration of Hafs, Imam Hafs, from Imam Asim. Now, it's not because Imam Hafs was the only person who narrated from Imam Asim this particular way of reading. It's because these were the people, like Imam Abu Hanifa is not the only person in the Hanafi madhab. There are hundreds and thousands of scholars who established the madhab, similarly with Imam Malik, etc., Imam Shafi'i. In fact, much of the Shafi'i madhab is as it was developed later by Imam An-Nawawi. So when we attribute something to a particular person, it doesn't mean that that particular person is the only person who developed that particular field of knowledge. So similarly, the riwayah of Hafs from Asim, these are the famous students of particular people. So Imam Asim, so this generation basically, Imam Hafs, for example, died, I believe, in 180, so the 2nd century Hijri. Now Imam Hafs, for those of you who recite, probably about 90% of the world recites according to the riwayah of Imam Hafs. As an example of a difference, and there are numerous examples, but as an example of the difference, most of you will be familiar with, for example, in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maliki, sometimes being read as Maliki, or Ihdina Sirat being read as Zirat, or being read as Sirat with a sin, Alayhim, being read as Alayhum. So these variant readings are basically variant readings that exist from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and have been transmitted accordingly. So the Qurra are the people who are experts in these readings, and they transmitted them. And there are numerous people throughout history who have collated these readings and collated the various asanid, the various chains of narrations for these readings. And again, for those of you who perhaps at foundation level or who are just starting to learn how to study, you may have, in your younger days, been taught by either teachers or the imam from the pulpit, in Jum'ah khutbahs. There may have been things like the Quran is as it's always been, and not a single dot, not a single harakah has changed, or maybe slightly exaggerated things said like that. And then you hear that and you think, but hang on, Maliki, there is a change there. So what does that change? So the problem with that, I think, is simplifying things a little bit too much when we're younger. I think people teach things in a way which simplify things such that when we actually start studying a bit more, hopefully when we start studying a bit more, then it makes us more familiar with these. But for some people, it can make them wonder, but hang on, I thought the Quran has always been the same, is always the same, Allah promised to preserve it, etc. But actually this was a means of that preservation. As an example, I mean, and again, this is perhaps not a great analogy, but to try and understand what we mean by these different readings, in the same way that for all of us who speak English, I assume we all speak English here, we can say grass, we can say grass, we can say bath, we can say bath, and it means exactly the same thing, right? The Queen can say, we are doing such and such a thing, and we know that she means she, as in I, am doing such and such a thing. Completely different words, I and we. And if you were a foreigner, if you were just new to the English language, you think, how on earth can she use, a completely different word, but it means exactly the same thing. So these things, of course, exist in any language. And similarly, they existed in the Arabic language. And at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people were reciting in different ways. And we know this from a hadith as well. The example, a good example, which highlights partly the nature of Umar radiallahu anhu, and I think he'll feature a few times today, where he was in Salah and he heard Hisham ibn Hakim ibn Hizam reciting Surah Al-Furqan, and he recited it in a way different to the way that Umar radiallahu anhu had learned it from the Prophet ﷺ. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he's narrating, he says, I wanted to grab him and take him to the Prophet ﷺ, which he does eventually, but he'll let him finish the prayer and then take him to the Prophet ﷺ. And then he presents this to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ asks Hisham to recite, and he asks Umar to recite, and he says, هَكَذَا أُنزِلَتْ وَهَكَذَا أُنزِلَتْ. So it was revealed this way, and it was also revealed this way. So this permission to recite in different ways was there from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and those different routes of transmission have carried on through time. I should touch upon one more thing here. Has anybody, and again I need a positive response here, has anybody heard the term Shatibi or Shatibiyah? Stick your hand up if you have heard the term. You have, okay. The reason I mention it here is because when people are teaching Quran, they'll say I'm teaching, sometimes they might even say what riwayah they're teaching according to. In the same way that if you grew up in a community that was mostly Hanafi, for example, you probably wouldn't grow up saying I follow the Hanafi madhab. You just say I'm Muslim, and you just practice the way you practice because everybody around you practices in that particular way. So similarly, if you're learning how to recite the Quran in a place where everybody recites the Quran in exactly the same way, you're not going to say I'm reciting the Quran according to the riwayat of Hafs and Asim. You're just going to say I'm reciting the Quran because there's no need to but now because of partly alhamdulillah because of the setting that we live in, people recite in different ways, people practice according to different madhabs, so there's more awareness, more knowledge of these things. The riwayah of Hafs and Asim, so I can put this on the board actually. So you've got a Qari. Is that appearing somewhere? So you've got the Qari, who's the reciter, who's Asim, right? Similarly, you've got the Rawi, who's usually a generation down, maybe a couple of generations down, and in our case, that's Hafs. Oops, sorry. Hafs. It should be a fa. And then beyond that, you've got what they call Ashab al-Turuq. So you can imagine this is in the first, second generation of Hijrah. After that, there are multiple, of course, students from these people. So as another example, for those of you who are from Morocco, Algeria, you'll probably recite according to the riwayah of Warsh, who recites from his Qari or his Imam Nafi'. Sorry for the terrible handwriting. So Nafi' is the teacher of Warsh in the same way that Asim is the teacher of Hafs. Now, I mentioned the term Shatibi, and it's important, again, just to give you a bit more detail because of the reading that we're going to be learning, the way that we're going to be learning how to recite in this course, and the applied when we're doing the applied later on online, inshallah. There are, beyond this, at various different generations, what they call Ashab al-Turuq. So the Ashab al-Turuq basically, in the same way that the Qari narrates a qira'ah, and the Rawi transmits or narrates a riwayah, so riwayat Hafs from Asim, the Ashab al-Turuq, they narrate or they transmit the turuq. So the tariq that we're reciting, going to be reciting according to, is the tariq of Imam al-Shatibi. Sorry, let me put that on so you can actually see it. So, al-Shatibi. Shatibi is Zatiba, which is a place in Andalusia. So this is an Andalusian scholar. Shatibi. Just keep that name in mind because I just want you to be aware that you're learning to recite according to, yes, the riwayah of Hafs from Asim, but the tariq, the route of transmission that you'll be learning is the route of transmission through Imam Ash-Shatibi. Because there are multiple turuq, multiple routes of transmission from Imam Hafs. So when I say multiple, there are Ibn al-Jazari, who we mentioned earlier, who's a scholar of Tajweed from the 9th century, he collects at least 52 routes of transmission from Imam Hafs. So there are 52 routes of transmission from Imam Hafs. That doesn't mean that there are massive differences in the different readings. These are very subtle differences. So for example, how long is a mud? For example, when you're reciting the Quran, you've seen like in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-A'raf, in certain surahs, there's some words which have a sad and a seen, and the seen might be on top or the seen might be on the bottom. So do you recite that with a sad or do you recite it with a seen? Yeah, so there are about 12 or 13 things in which they differ, these ashab al-turuq. But they're very, very subtle things. The important thing here is that if you're reciting according to one tariq, then the people of qira'ah, the people of recitation, the scholars of recitation, they would often insist that one recites according to one particular tariq. And you can see the rationale for that. In the same way, if I use that analogy that I used earlier of languages, if you're speaking in a Brummy accent, you wouldn't suddenly switch in the same sentence to like a Scottish accent. It would just sound odd, right? So similarly, if you're reciting, again, this perhaps not a perfect analogy, but it just shows you the kind of the oddness of it. If you're reciting according to one particular tariq, or one particular riwayah, or one particular qira'ah, you wouldn't suddenly switch halfway through the verse or halfway through the reading into another riwayah, tariq, qira'ah, etc. Yeah? So it's ashab al-turuq. Ashab, plural of sahib. Does that make sense, this thing about ashab al-turuq, the ruwat, the plural of rawi, ruwat, and the qurra, plural of qari. So just to be familiar with those terms. So you're learning, what we're learning here on this course is the riwayah of Hafs from Asim according to the tariq of Imam Ash-Shatibi. So an tariq Ash-Shatibi. So I might mention that term again later. Where does that bring us to? I think the rules the legal aspects.
Legal status.
Yep.
Sunnah according to the jurists, Fard Kifah, or Ain according to the Quran.
So, fard, have you guys come across the term fard kifaya, or just kifaya generally when you're studying fiqh? So kifaya basically means something which is a communal obligation. So fard, of course, means something which is obligatory or an obligation, and of course that has a very definite legal meaning within fiqh. And kifaya means something which is communal. So as an example, the janazah is something which is a communal obligation. If somebody within the community fulfills that obligation, then there's no sin upon the rest of the community. Similarly, people say about things like i'tikaf, as long as somebody within the community is performing that obligation, there's no blame or sin upon the rest of the community. Whereas something like fard ayn is an individual obligation. So the fard prayer, for example, or the fasting, it's not enough for a single person in the community to fast or to pray for that to be lifted, that obligation to be lifted from the rest of the community. So the people of qira'ah, as I was saying earlier, the people within a particular science will tend to overemphasize perhaps the importance sometimes of their own discipline. So they say that the recitation of the Quran with tajweed applied, i.e. reciting with tajweed the Quran as it should be recited, is fard ayn. Now again, in my mind, that seems a little OTT because fard ayn is something like the prayer, right? And reciting the Quran with tajweed, as a teacher of tajweed, I agree it's important, but it's not as important as a prayer. It's not as important as fasting the fast of Ramadan, right? So unless you're understanding fard in the linguistic sense, i.e. it's essential, it's necessary, fine. But to raise it to the legal status of something like prayer or fasting, etc., that's perhaps exaggerating a little bit, which is why we take our fiqh from the people of fiqh. And the people of fiqh generally say that reciting with tajweed is sunnah mu'akkada. It's something that the Prophet ﷺ, of course, always did. That's how he recited the Quran, which is why we similarly recite in that way. The rules of tajweed, again, the scholars of tajweed say that it's fard kifaya. There must be somebody within the community who is teaching the rules of tajweed, otherwise the whole community will be sinning. Again, that seems slightly exaggerated. The rules of tajweed are important. They help one to better understand tajweed, better teach tajweed, but to call say that the whole community is sinning if somebody in the community is not teaching tajweed, it should certainly be encouraged, of course. And people like Imam Ghazali, for example, they use the word fard kifaya also, not just from a religious or theological point of view, but also to encourage the generation within a community of people who fulfill certain important needs. So he mentions, I think, a muhasib, so somebody who can, I guess, do the accounts or do the sums or that kind of thing. I think he mentions doctors as well. I'm sure he mentioned other people as well, but he mentioned certain people who within a community are fulfill the basic needs of that community, and the community, therefore, it's an obligation upon the community to generate people who can do that. That's a slight aside, but from the point of view of tajweed, yes, there should be somebody within the community who's teaching the Quran, but to impose upon the community that there must be somebody who is an expert in the rules of tajweed, again, the scholars of fiqh take a slightly lesser approach to that, and they call it sunnah, which I think is perhaps more appropriate. Wallahu a'lam.
rules are those which we shall study inshallah. For example, regarding points of articulation, qualities of letters, where and for how long to extend mad letters, when to nasalize gunna, etc.
So these are the rules that we're going to cover inshallah over the course of today. There are some verses I think in the notes as well, and some ahadith which basically are references which are often used in tajweed text for often I mean when a text or when a scholar is making a particular point, they'll often reference that, of course, with verses from the Quran and ahadith. And again, it's probably a good thing to point out here that sometimes we inappropriately use verses of the Quran to make a point that we're, or to buttress or to support a point that we're trying to make. So here, for example, I think the verse in Surah Muzammil, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, and recite the Quran, and different mufassirun, different scholars of tafsir have interpreted this in different ways. So tartil, what does tartil mean? Meaning in slow, measured tones, meaning letter by letter so that it's clear, meaning clearly, meaning slowly. Scholars of tajweed will use this verse to say, and therefore one must recite with tajweed, and therefore one must, and as an extrapolation to that, and therefore one must ensure that the muds are the right length, etc. And yes, they're associated, but to say that this verse is only about learning tajweed, of course, is limiting the meaning of the verse. And even more so for the other verse I've quoted. And I quote it only because the books of tajweed often quote this verse. I think it's in the notes, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَتْلُونَهُ حَقَّ تِلَاوَتِهِ. And this is what we talked about already earlier. The حَقُّ التِّلَاوَةِ, the right of recitation, is not just tajweed. So to limit this verse, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ, those to whom we have given the book, يَتْلُونَهُ, they recite it, حَقَّ تِلَاوَتِهِ, giving it its full right of recitation. And to limit this verse just to tajweed is again doing a disservice to this verse, because it means, as we discussed earlier, much more than that. So that brings us to the end of the introduction and foundations. I don't know how we're doing for time. 11:03. 11:15 I think was our break. I think we're going to stop for questions about 5 past. So we can perhaps stop for questions now. If people have questions, we can take them, and if there aren't any questions, likewise online. And if there are any questions, we can move on. But if you can use a mic, please, so that the online guys can hear as well.
I think when you were talking about the different type of recitation, like the halves that we learn at the moment. So, for example, when we are trying to learn to recite, and we are listening to a reciter online, so how are we supposed to know which is it hafsa? Is it something that is a different recitation that is doing? How do we find out?
Yeah, no. So the vast majority of recitations that you'll find online, if it's not qualified as to what it is, it will probably be riwayat, hafs, and asim. Generally, if it's something else, for example, warsh or khalaf or various other readings, it will say fi riwayat warsh or fi riwayat khalaf or fi riwayat such and such. So generally, if it doesn't say who it is, it probably is riwayat, hafs, and asim. Now, you can't say that for sure, of course. So if you want to know for sure, then of course it should say fi riwayat, hafs, and asim, or in the riwayat of hafs from asim. Now, having said that, this is where this thing about turuq comes in. So people often listen to readings from or recitations from the imams of the Haramain. So for example, the reading of Imam Sudais is quite popular, and generally the readings of the imams of the Haramain, if you listen to them recite, they'll recite, so for example in Surah Masad, they'll recite, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. What I'll be teaching you today is that you should be reciting in the tariq that we're learning, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. So this is from one of the other purposes of today, and generally learning tajweed, is that you improve your own hearing so that you can feed that back. So what was the difference there? Yeah. So the mud, just again for online people, the yada, the mud on the dal, was elongated beyond the length of the first reading. But though they're both riwayat, hafs, and asim, the imams of the Haramain, generally most of them, then they recite according to that particular tariq where they will say tabbat yada abi. What we're learning today, which is the most commonly taught reading, is tabbat yada abi, right? A longer mud. We'll talk about why that mud is longer, etc. But this is what I was saying about the tariq. And this thing about ensuring that you're staying within one particular tariq, people will hear the imams of the Haramain reciting that way, and they'll think, oh, okay, I can recite like that because it's riwayat, hafs, and asim. But then what I'm telling you today is that actually riwayat, hafs, and asim has multiple turuq within it, and one should stay within one particular tariq within that. So if for example, somebody's reciting according to that mud length, then they need to know the other differences within that turuq so that they're consistent within that particular reading. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that answers your question. So if it says riwayat, hafs, and asim, then you know it's riwayat, hafs, and asim. But even if it says riwayat, hafs, and asim, it may be that it's a different tariq to the one that I'm teaching you today. But you wouldn't know unless it says رواية حفص عن عاصم عن طريق الشاطبي, then you wouldn't know exactly what tariq it is. I just want to emphasize the point of the tariq today because it's something which is not commonly taught at a basic level, and this is at a basic level that we're studying tajweed, but I think it's important to know about it from this level onwards, inshallah.
That kind of emphasize the importance of learning with a experienced teacher because he guides us on which reciters we need.
So again, just for the online people, so the sister was saying it's hence the importance of learning with an experienced teacher. I agree, but of course there are multiple teachers within the community who are teaching who aren't experienced, and without them our level of Quranic reading perhaps would be even lesser. So like in Oxford, for example, we offer teacher training for people who are teaching within homes, etc., to try and raise the general level of teaching within the community. So it doesn't mean that one shouldn't only teach if they're experienced teachers, but teachers should try and become experienced. Absolutely.
I just want to know, when the Quran was revealed, was it revealed in like 7 different ways?
So this hadith that I mentioned earlier about Umar radiallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ ends that hadith by saying that the Quran has been revealed on 7 ahruf, on 7 letters, 7 ahruf. What that actually means is understood in multiple different ways by the scholars of hadith. The confusion basically arises because, so this question that you've asked, was it revealed in 7 different ways? There are 7 well-known readings of the Quran, and they were canonized or codified basically by somebody, his name was Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid, in the 4th century, I believe. And the reason he codified them was basically because at that time, again, it was a response to something that was happening at the time. In the same way that Uthman radiallahu anhu, he compiled the second compilation of the Quran in its book form, in its mushaf form. Uthman radiallahu anhu was encouraged to do that because, again, the Muslims had spread far and wide. People were differing as to how the Quran should be read because, again, the Quran had spread beyond the Arab lands where people knew how to speak, read, etc., recite Arabic. So that compilation basically helped prevent differences in the reading of the Quran. Similarly, Ibn Mujahid, what he did, at his time there were grammarians who were basically, grammarians like to play with the language. And for them, they were for example, in the recitation of the Quran, they were theorizing that actually it could be recited this way, it could be recited that way. So it could be Alhamdulillah, it could be Alhamdulillah, it could be Alhamdulillah. All of these have possible, all of these are grammatical possibilities. So to limit that from happening, because this was happening by people who are not necessarily Arab and people who wouldn't necessarily have had that connection to the Quran at the time of revelation, Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid, he basically collected 7 well-known teachers at the time and canonized their readings. And those are what are known as the 7 well-known readings today. That's sometimes conflated with the 7 ahruf of the Prophet ﷺ. But what that actually means, it definitely doesn't mean the 7 readings that we know today. So for example, the readings are Imam Hafs from Asim. So Asim is one qari, Nafi' is another qari, Hamza is another qari. These are 7 qaris from the 1st and 2nd century, or 2nd century Hijri, from whom we have these 7 well-known readings. And there are more beside that, but that's not, so your question was the Quran revealed in 7 different ways? Not in the sense that there are 7 different readings, if that makes sense. The 7 different ways, what does it mean? It means that, so some scholars, for example, think that it may be in the 7 dialects of different Arab tribes. It may be 7 particular thematic areas within the Quran. So there are different understandings of what Sabat Ahruf means, but what it definitely doesn't mean is the 7 well-known readings of the Quran that we have today. That's answering your question with a negative answer. I don't know if does that answer your question, or does it clarify?
No, it doesn't.
Go on, so ask again.
What I want to know is, which one did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what did he recite?
We don't know. He allowed all of these. So he permitted all of these readings. So in the same way that so we don't know whether he read, for example, according to the way that Imam Hafs teaches or Imam Warsh teaches. Again, just come back to that analogy, again, not a perfect analogy that I mentioned earlier. You may well speak English differently to the way that your teachers speak English, right? And again, vary from place to place within not just a country, but within a city itself. People from different settings will speak English in different ways. So similarly, do we know, I mean, I should look into this a bit more myself, but as far as I know, we don't know exactly which of these readings was the reading of the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, but we know that the Quran is from Allah through Jibreel to the Prophet ﷺ, but exactly, I mean, the accent or the dialect or the particular reading that was used by the Prophet ﷺ, but if I find out, I'll let you know, inshallah. Any other questions? Are we okay for time, Abu? The kettle's not boiled yet, so we're okay for time. Okay.
So would the Qur'an have differed among each other to the point where they'd say you're reciting it incorrectly? Or so you know, with the 7 different forms of recitation,
Yeah.
would say Imam Asim have said that the people who recite in Warsh are doing it incorrectly, or would they have accepted it?
So yeah, good question. I think Shaykh Akram did a Adab al-Ikhtilaf seminar, possibly last week or the week before, in terms of the adab of differing, or the etiquettes of differing. There are narrations from the time where generally people, you'd hope, would have respected each other, and there are examples of that kind of respect. But you can imagine when people get particularly deep within a discipline, they can again perhaps behave in ways in which you might think are inappropriate. So this Abu Bakr al-Mujahid that I mentioned, he was close to the people of the court, and people who recited in ways according to those which he'd recommended be the canonized or codified ways, he had them whipped to try and ensure that the way people were reciting. So for example, Ibn Miqsam, I think his name was a Nahwi, who was reciting according to the reading of Ibn Mas'ud, if I remember correctly. He had him whipped so as to prevent that from becoming widespread in the community, because what he was trying to do was trying to standardize things and try to ensure that the Quran remained protected. And we can perhaps see these as means through which, we said that Allah promised to preserve and protect the Quran. We can perhaps see these as means through which the Quran was preserved and it wasn't lost like the book of the Christians was, or the book of the Jews was. These were perhaps means, and sometimes people being people, and sometimes even scholars being people, made I think what we can say are mistakes. Should you whip somebody because they're reciting in a way that you don't agree with? I would certainly never promote such a thing. Not that I have the power to do such a thing, of course, but it did happen. It did happen. So people did disagree. People disagreed quite strongly to the point that this kind of thing would happen as well. And you know this even from examples of people like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was whipped and imprisoned for certain beliefs that he held about the Quran, which went against the prevailing view of, which again, if you think about it now, what that discussion was about, it seems almost, how could they have even been discussing such a thing? It seems such an odd thing to be discussing. But at that time, it was a hot topic. And if the court had a particular, or the ruling class had a particular view, and there were scholars who differed from that, then the scholars who were closely associated with the ruling class, they obviously brought their power to bear in ways which perhaps weren't appropriate. Is that okay? I don't know if the kettle's still boiling. The intro foundations, that's what we've covered now. In the next session, inshallah, we'll touch briefly upon, that was meant to be last session, but we'll touch briefly upon etiquettes of recitation. And these are things like, in terms of purity, being in a state of wudu, etc., when reciting. Again, we won't go too much into differences of opinion. So I'll teach mostly things from within the Hanafi madhab with a few differences. But again, your fiqh, etc., you should be taken from people who you trust, people of piety, and seek their advice in terms of these things that we will be discussing in the next session, inshallah. So there are no other questions. We'll break now for 15 minutes. If people have got questions that they want to ask privately, feel free. Otherwise, please go enjoy your boiled tea, assuming it's boiled. Assalamu alaikum.